Hi everyone, I'm Daniel Hallstrom. I'm an assistant legal officer at the FRU representation unit, and I work in both employment and social security. So I supervise volunteers and also have my own caseload of cases. So this talk has been scheduled for about 40 minutes, but I propose to speak for about 20 to 25, and then I'll take as many questions as you all have for me at the end, and I'm very happy to talk to any one of you individually who wants to ask me a question that you don't feel comfortable asking in the room. So I'm going to talk to you about four things. Firstly, I'm going to say a bit about what the FRU representation unit is, or FRU for short, what we do, how you can get involved, and why you should get involved. So the FRU representation unit has been providing representation in the Social Security and Employment Tribunal since 1972. So this is our 50th year, our 50th anniversary this year that we're celebrating. We're a charity, and we were founded by bar school students in the 70s with the express intention of providing practical advocacy experience for law students. FRU helps people who can't afford lawyers and who aren't otherwise eligible for legal aid. And the bulk of our work is done by volunteers, mostly law students like yourselves. We also work with some legal professionals in the early years of their practice, mainly pupil barristers and junior barristers, as well as trainee solicitors. So our business model operates at the intersection of altruism and self-interest. Our volunteers plug a gap in the provision and availability of legal services to people trying to vindicate their rights in cases that are hugely important to them. So where they've lost their job, or they've had wages taken from them by their employer, where they've lost their much needed disability benefits, where they've been discriminated against at work, or been landed with an unaffordable bill to repay benefits that they say that they were entitled to. Ordinarily, those people would probably have to navigate the tribunal system alone, without access to legal training, legal resources, and the time to work to prepare their cases properly. And that's where a FRU volunteer representative comes in. And what you, as a volunteer, get out of it is a range of practical skills, real experience of real cases, and useful examples that you can use in applications come pupillage application time. So as a FRU volunteer, you're almost entirely responsible for the conduct of the case, subject to the supervision of a legal officer like myself. So no one else will be in your client conference or in the tribunal with you. It is your case and ultimately your responsibility. And you'll need to be able to commit a good deal of time and effort to your cases. But in return, as I've said, you'll gain invaluable experience, and you'll also make a real contribution to assisting our clients who would otherwise face the tribunal alone. So the sorts of things that running a FRU case entails, so obviously we work in both employment and social security tribunals, and the demands and the way those cases are run are slightly different. So in employment, you might run a client conference, you'll draft documents like witness statements, schedules of loss, letters of advice, skeleton arguments, settlement agreements. You'll conduct settlement negotiations with the solicitor. You'll represent clients in the tribunal themselves. Cross-examination you'll have to do, oral submissions, re-examination perhaps. And then depending on how the case has gone, you might have to advise your clients on appeal and possibly represent them in appeal. So on the social security side, again, you'll have to run your own client conference, draft written submissions, again, work on witness handling skills in the Social Security Tribunal, which are subtly different from those in the Employment Tribunal, and obviously make oral submissions, possibly appeals onwards to the upper tribunal. But these cases also engage a lot of soft skills that are really important to preparing you for a career as a solicitor or indeed as a barrister, as I suspect most of you are set on doing. So client and personality management is such a huge part of running a real-life case. So depending on what sort of case you take on, you might be representing a vulnerable client with mental health issues, or an educated professional who's recently been laid off from their job, who takes a very different approach and view of their case than you might do. And of course, you'll have to engage with solicitors, potentially with barristers and judges, each with their own distinctive positions and priorities. And that throws up all sorts of very difficult client handling skills and personality management skills. And it will also sort of teach you how to work under supervision, which is a hugely important skill for pupillage. Another thing which is really useful in running a FRU case is practical experience of ethical issues, the sorts of ethical issues that you might experience working in practice. So we follow the Bar Standards Board Code of Conduct, and any of you who are on the barrister training course will know kind of broadly what that is and what that entails, but basically it's a kind of a manual for how barristers ought to conduct themselves, where they owe kind of various duties, their duties to the client versus those to the court. And often on FRU cases, you'll be faced with situations that throw up all sorts of ethical issues that you might only read about otherwise on your professional ethics course, on the bar course. So hugely helpful there. And obviously there are a host of practical skills beside that you might also develop and pick up. So, as I said previously, FRU works primarily in the social security and employment tribunals. So we take on cases that have been referred from frontline advice agencies. And when the cases are referred, they'll have a hearing date in the calendar. So it will be clear kind of what commitment is required going forward to the hearing. So as a FRU volunteer, you can choose to take on either social security or employment cases, or indeed both. But there are separate training requirements for each stream. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about how you might choose between those two streams, what sort of things you might do as an employment volunteer versus the things you might do as a social security volunteer. So in terms of employment cases, we categorize our cases into sort of difficulty levels. So there are 3 basic difficulty levels of cases. So there are any rep cases, and broadly speaking, that will include things like unfair dismissal. So where someone says, I shouldn't have been dismissed. Unlawful deduction of wages. So where someone is going to the tribunal to say that they're owed wages that they should have been paid. Or wrongful dismissal is another common type of any rep case. So where someone says they were dismissed in a way that breached their contract. The next difficulty level up is not first or second cases, and those will involve things like whistleblowing or simple discrimination or cases that involve the application of the 2P regulations, so that basically deal with when companies transfer businesses over to other companies. And the third sort of difficulty level of FRU cases we call experience rep cases, and it's generally the sort of case you could take on after 5 FRU cases. And those involve things like discrimination, kind of multi-day discrimination cases, possibly equal pay cases, and onwards appeals to the Employment Appeal Tribunal. So obviously the Employment Tribunal pits employees against their employers, and there invariably tends to be a solicitor or even a barrister appearing for the other side. And that obviously has its own challenges in terms of your conduct of the case. You're negotiating and dealing with an experienced legal professional. So once you take on a case, you'll conference with your client, organise the disclosure process, draft witness statements, and generally just prepare the case for tribunal. You'll also prepare a schedule of loss and negotiate with the other side. And on the day, you'll attend the hearing to represent your client, cross-examine them in the tribunal, cross-examine the witnesses for the respondent, and make submissions. Our cases are listed from anywhere between a few hours to several days. Employment cases, of course, can and do go on for longer, but we only take on relatively short cases, so less than 4 days. Employment cases are generally longer than those in Social Security, and there tends to be a longer lead time as well leading up to them. So we often receive cases months, if not at the moment years, before they're due to be heard. That's invariably true. It's not always the case. Sometimes we do get cases that are a few weeks out from a hearing. But generally speaking, it's easier to fit employment volunteering at FRU around other commitments, such as a full-time job. There is, of course, more scope for advocacy in the tribunals. Essentially, the employment tribunals apply simplified rules and simplified rules of procedure that otherwise apply in ordinary courts. But cases do often settle, and that process of settling cases and negotiating can also be really useful advocacy experience. I'd say in some cases as useful as appearing before a tribunal itself. I mean, they're essentially an exercise in bringing someone around to a position, which is the key skill. Employment cases give you valuable experience of trial preparation, witness handling, and cross-examination is particularly important. And obviously, those of you on the bar course, you'll sort of study cross-examination, and you'll do cross-examination practically through the year. But it's great to have the opportunity to be able to put those skills into practice in cases that really do matter. So employment law as a practice area is incredibly broad and rich. There's lots of interesting academic points. Obviously, it touches on issues of huge social importance, and there's lots of overspill with other areas of law as well. So things like contract and commercial law, tax, pensions, those sorts of things. It's a surprising volume of public law as well in employment, and obvious synergies with a public law practice, things like discrimination work. Obviously, there's a lot of overspill there. So on the social security side, so the cases that we do mostly concern disputes about incapacity and disability. So broadly, our cases involve a client who has applied for benefits on the basis of a physical or mental incapacity but has been refused benefits. So FRU volunteers assemble medical evidence, present their client's case to the tribunal, and the tribunal decides whether that claimant is entitled to benefits. So we tend to get social security cases only a short time out from when they're listed. So social security volunteering, I'd say, is perhaps best suited for people who are able to have a kind of clear run of a week or two or longer to work on a particular case intensively. So it's a sort of short spurt of work rather than the slightly longer term commitment that's often entailed in volunteering on the employment side. But obviously the bread and butter of our work is disability benefit appeals. But if you continue to work for us, if you continue to pick up cases, you might end up assisting clients in a wide range of other issues, sometimes engaging human rights, sometimes issues of EU law and its application, as well as occasionally appearing, or we do some judicial review work and appeals in front of the upper tribunal. So social security practice, social security volunteering, I think is probably best suited to people who are interested in practicing public law and administrative law. It will introduce you to the application of complex statutory schemes, how to interpret them, how to apply those sorts of provisions. Obviously, that's important to all areas of practice, but it has a particular relevance in administrative law. But there's also lots of cross-pollination, overspill with other areas of law. You'd be surprised. Equity in trusts in capital disputes, obviously lots of public law issues, housing law, and so on. So advocacy in the tribunal itself tends to be a bit less demanding than the employment tribunal. That's because the tribunal takes on a more inquisitorial role, so they take on a more proactive role in trying to get evidence out of a client. So you may find yourself speaking a lot less than you would in an equivalent employment tribunal, but that does not mean that your job as a volunteer is any less important. In fact, there's a real skill to being able to do it well and be able to present a case as attractively as possible. And the best FRU volunteer advocates are sensitive to the nature and the detail of their client's evidence, and can use that to build a powerful case, even if they're not, speaking directly as much. And one of the virtues of social security volunteering is that you're virtually guaranteed court time, which can really help to build confidence in terms of, navigating a courtroom as a space. So in terms of how you can get involved, we're based in London, but we work in other tribunals around the southeast as well, and occasionally a little bit further afield, but there's a kind of a London focus to our work. Obviously, one of the benefits of the changed kind of working landscape after COVID is that remote volunteering is now very much the norm. Our offices are open, but most of our volunteers choose to volunteer remotely. So we're able to facilitate volunteers working from further afield. I know that some of you have come some way today. Remote cases are still the norm, but obviously, the only thing we'd ask if in the event where someone kind of lived outside of London was that you were able to ensure that you could make a tribunal venue, on the date that the hearing was listed. There are obviously other organisations in Leeds and also at the Nottingham Law Centre, the Nottingham Legal Advice Clinic rather, at the law school, that operate a very similar model to ours. But of course, we're happy to accept volunteers from further afield, from anywhere really. But as I said, just be aware that courts can and do list things face to face. In terms of the eligibility requirements for FRU volunteering, what level do you need to have reached in order to volunteer for us? So this is slightly different between the two tracks. So on the employment side, you must have completed a qualifying law degree, so an LLB, or started the GDL. On the social security side, you need to have reached at least May in the penultimate year of an LLB, or have started the graduate diploma in law. And if you have other experience working in the tribunals that we work in, even if you don't strictly meet those academic requirements, we can also waive those academic requirements and some of our training requirements as well. So in order to volunteer for FRU, you have to do 4 things. You have to attend a training day. You then have to pass a test to assess your competence to take on FRU cases. You have to observe a tribunal hearing, and then you have to attend an office induction. So I'll go through each of those. So our training days are essentially a weekend of intensive training in either social security or employment law, touching on key aspects of those practice areas and the basic rules of engagement of running FRU cases. So the last set of training sessions, the last training day was held for both employment and social security in October of 2022. We expect to hold the next sessions in May or June of next year. We did run cases more frequently throughout the year prior to COVID, but obviously there's been some kind of effects that COVID has had on the capacity of FRU to kind of, and also in terms of the volume of referrals that we receive. So we've reduced the number of training days in order to ensure that everyone has a reasonable chance of taking on a case. There's a £50 fee to attend the training day, and that goes towards our running costs as a charity and obviously the costs of running the sessions themselves. So once you've done a training day, you then have to pass a legal test to make sure that you're ready to represent a client and competent to do so. So essentially the FRU test is an exercise in statutory interpretation. So we give you a factual scenario, we give you some legislation, and then we ask you some questions essentially applying the legislation to the scenario. It requires no previous knowledge or experience of that particular area of law. It's an exercise of pure legal reasoning. And once you've passed a test, you then have to observe a tribunal. And obviously that's self-explanatory. So you have to try to observe a tribunal in the relevant practice area. Now we're aware obviously that things being remote, it's increasingly harder to turn up to the tribunal in your local area and sort of see cases. That is something you hypothetically can still do, but obviously we realise that it's difficult for people. That is obviously a, we say it's an important prerequisite, but obviously, we sort of operate a trust principle, basically, and obviously it's hugely helpful to see a tribunal in action to kind of understand what sort of environment you might be kind of operating in. And then finally, you have to attend an office induction where we sort of explain in a brief session the practical ins and outs of running a case as a FRU volunteer. So I think I think I mentioned briefly, but I'll just reiterate. Obviously, our case volumes are a little lower than they used to be prior to the pandemic. That means, and obviously we are a small organisation, we do have kind of a limited supervision capacity. And obviously the demand for our help, as well as the demand for cases for representatives, considerably outstrips our ability to assist on them. But yeah, I mean, every indication is that trend is reversing, and we are kind of almost back up to pre-pandemic levels. And obviously, I think it's been hard across the advice sector and the charity sector more generally throughout the pandemic. But we're sort of come to the other side of that a bit. In terms of why you should volunteer for FRU, I mean, I make 3 points basically. The first is obviously practical experience and development. Running FRU cases, you end up doing very similar things to what barristers do in and out in practice, so day in and day out in practice. And there's no better sort of confirmation or test of whether or not you actually enjoy the work than actually getting a flavour of what that entails. And obviously in the process of doing that, you'll develop skills and competencies that are required for a successful career at the bar as well. The second thing is making a real difference. So I was going through the numbers the other day, and volunteers for FRU have won something in the order of £3 to £4 million for clients in settlements and tribunal awards in the last year. And that only captures part of the story. Obviously, we don't merits test cases at all. Many of our cases, the value that we provide is, the ability of someone to feel that, someone's there for them and fighting their corner in a particularly difficult point in their lives. Faced with a tribunal system that is, really difficult to navigate even for experienced legal professionals. So, it is of huge value, the work that our volunteers do, there is, it's really good. And I mean, the third point I'd make is obviously examples for pupillage applications. So come interview time, come applications time, it is really, really valuable to be able to put something into your application that shows you, applying and using your legal skills and competencies in practice. Your ability to think quickly on your feet in a particular situation in a tribunal venue, your ability to manage a difficult client handling situation. All of those things are, gold dust for pupillage applications. And, I think, obviously, I think it's something which, a lot of barristers in practice have done. There's a lot of residual kind of goodwill within the bar, sort of towards FRU. Lots of kind of people have been through volunteering, and I mean, I think it really kind of pays off in terms of converting that experience into things that you can say to interview panels come interview time. So I think that was all I basically wanted to cover.